afternoon. This is Mary Hunt at the Water Office. I'm here with Liza Johnson, my colleague, and Diane New is traveling but sends her greetings. I want to welcome each and every one of you in a very special way, and I particularly want to welcome back Gale Yee to Water. Gale did a program in January of 2020 on an earlier publication, The Hebrew Bible, Feminist and Intersectional Perspectives. And I recommend both the book and the talk, which is on our website at www.waterwomensalliance.org. We got a taste then, and I think you'll see today what an excellent thinker and teacher Gale Yee is. I didn't realize I was going to be hosting a reunion for EDS people, Episcopal Divinity School people, but we're glad to have you with us. And I want to make a special word of welcome to those from the Pacific Asian and North American Asian Women in Theology and Ministry group, known affectionately as Pan Autumn. I'm sure those who are members of the group are as proud of Gale as we are. As one of your members, she is certainly a role model and a very supportive sister to so many people and has been over a long period of time. So I want to congratulate Pan Autumn on your recent incorporation as a nonprofit group, and just to say from Water that we look forward to learning and collaborating with you, as we have for many years. Like all of Water's efforts, this Water Talk is not simply an academic seminar. It's a way to learn in order to bring what we learn to the creation of a more just and equitable world. Gale Yee's new book, which I will show several times just so that you get the visual and run out and get it, is part of that effort to create a more just and equitable world. Her book, Towards an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics, an intersectional anthology, was published this year by Cascade Books in Eugene, Oregon. It's an example of how that work is done. As Kwak Pui Lan, who's with us today, has written about it, this groundbreaking volume charts the development of a leading Asian American feminist biblical scholar's hermeneutical journey. To that, I can only add my own words and say, lucky we are to have a close-up look at it and with her today. Water has been located in Silver Spring, Maryland since 1983, but we know that there's a rich history of this place long before we got here. We acknowledge that we're on indigenous land. Silver Spring, Maryland, where we're located, is on the traditional and contemporary land of the Piscataway and Nechongtong people, sometimes known as Anacostions, the original stewards of this territory. We are committed to making clear the names of these lands and the community members from these nations who reside among us. We acknowledge the trauma that is deeply embedded in the foundation of this country and recognize the deep historical, spiritual, and personal trauma that has impacted indigenous communities, communities of color, as well as immigrants and other peoples. We affirm the right of all people to bring their whole selves and their stories into this space. And we confirm our intention to promote healing, respect, and love for all people and our commitment to caring for creation. That's the commitment of Water. So welcome again, and our introduction of our speaker will be followed by her teaching us for 20 or 25 minutes. So there'll be plenty of time toward the end of our time together for questions and discussions. So please listen and enjoy. We'll take notes that'll be on our website shortly after Gale Yee has had a look at them for accuracy and to add anything we may have missed. Liza will see to it that our audio is muted to cut down on noise and assure a clear line for the presentation. But when Gale finishes and we move to Q&A, of course, you'll be invited to ask questions. We'll end at 2 o'clock Eastern time to respect everyone's schedule. You can re-listen or point others in the direction of this teleconference by going to Water's website at www.waterwomensalliance.org. Look under programs and teleconferences, and under Water Talks, you'll find this one. We'll keep the Zoom line open, however, a little bit after 2 for those who wish to chit chat, but the official session will end at the top of the hour with our gratitude to Gale Yee. So let me introduce Gale Yee with a warm Water welcome, although many of you know her so well that I need not really do this. She is, as you know, the Nancy King Professor of Biblical Studies Emerita, Episcopal Divinity School. She taught for decades there and in other institutions where she brought her insight about the Bible, feminism, and intersectional thinking to the classroom. She's the author of Poor Banished Children of Eve, Women as Evil in the Hebrew Bible, another volume, Jewish Feasts and the Gospel of John, Contemporary Tradition in the Book of Hosea, a commentary. And you'll see that her scope is broad. She's also written articles in the New Interpreter's Bible, as well as being the editor of Judges and Method, New Approaches in Biblical Studies, 2007, co-editor of the Fortress Commentary on the Old Testament and Apocrypha in 2014, and the book I mentioned before, The Hebrew Bible, Feminist and Intersectional Perspectives in 2018 from Fortress Press. In 2019, Gale was president of the Society of Biblical Literature, and she pays tribute in her book to Kwak Pui Lan, who was also around that time the president of the American Academy of Religion. So our sisters at Episcopal Divinity School had the learned societies locked down. They really had a real hold on them and brought distinguished leadership to both of those institutions. In 2020, Gale was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity from Virginia Theological Seminary, another of the Episcopal schools, which some of us watched cheering her on from our homes. Sad only that we couldn't be there to cheer her on in person. Gale lives now in a retirement community called Pilgrim Place, a famous retirement community in Claremont, California, known for its social activism and its very amazing people. And before you joined us, she was telling us about some of the experiences they've had recently, especially during the COVID pandemic. And it's not easy to have a large group of older people gathered together and trying to keep them all safe. But Pilgrim Place does that, and they do it with style and with attention to the whole person. So I'm glad you're there, Gale. I know you're with some of my favorite people, and I'm sure that it's a stimulating community and a place, as we can tell from the bookshelves behind you, where the life of the mind is honored in so many ways. So welcome to you, Gale. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us so we can learn about thinking intersectionally about our social locations, your topic for today. I present with delight Dr. Gale Yee.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Mary, and all your water crew, and all of you for inviting me to give this water talk on thinking intersectionally about our social location. Now, let's first talk about that word intersectionality. This is a word that arose in a branch of legal studies known as critical race theory. Now, as you might know, critical race theory has become the latest football that the Republicans are kicking around in the US culture wars. Absolutely ignorant of the theory itself. What they do is weaponize it to slander any attempts to educate students and the overall population about the US's tragic and horrendous history of racial hatred. Now, critical race theory is a legal discipline that analyzes and critiques the social construction of race and how institutionalized racism consigns people of color to the lower levels of a stratified society. The term intersectionality arises from the 1989 work of one of the originators of critical race theory, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. Even though the interconnections among gender, race, and class were investigated by African-American theorists and other women of color long before the term became trendy, like the Combahee River Collective. We have one of the original Combahee River Collective writers here at Pilgrim Place, Margot Okazawa Ray. Also Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks. I mean, these African-American theorists have been working on, intersectionality long before the term became trendy. In 1976, 5 Black women unsuccessfully sued General Motors for race discrimination. General Motors claimed that they did not discriminate against these women because they hired both Black men and women, albeit white women, okay? Now, Crenshaw argued that these single-axis hiring policies were not able to respond to the very visible invisibility of women who were not white and Blacks who were not men, okay? Now, Crenshaw used the concept of intersectionality to signify the different ways in which race and gender interacted to shape the various dimensions of Black women's experiences. Now, scholars have extended intersectionality beyond race and gender to include class, sexual orientation, nationhood, citizenship, disability, and other categories of analysis. All of these are somehow interconnected with each other. And they've also utilized intersectionality to investigate the various oppressions associated with these categories, such as classism, homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, ableism, and ethnocentrism, and so on. So today, I'm going to use intersectionality to talk about our social locations and how the various aspects of our identities are intersected, whether we are conscious of it or not. Now, Mary asked me to send you a couple chapters of my new book, Towards an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics. The introduction that I sent, some of you might have already read, okay? And in that introduction, I talked about a self-inventory that I give out to my students during our first class of every semester. Now, this inventory asks students to identify factors at play when they interpret the biblical text, okay? And there are 18 factors listed, okay? And they include, of course, gender, race, ethnicity, social class, education, explicit or implicit political stances, their religious denominations, if they have one, etc., etc. Now, discussing this survey was a way to get my students to introduce themselves to one another, themselves and to one another. But it also made them aware of the forces operative in their study of the Bible, whether they were conscious of it or not. Now, what was particularly interesting were the factors that they passed over or dismissed. I remember one Episcopalian priest in Hong Kong when I was teaching there. He insisted that his gender made no difference in his study of the Bible. Well, of course, you know that he changed his position after my course, okay? So I had to reflect for this book and for today's presentation. I had to reflect autobiographically on my social location over the years by considering how I would complete a similar survey if I was in the shoes of my students. And I want you to eventually think intersectionally about all the facets of your identities that make up the person you are. So where do I begin? Now, unlike most Asian Americans that I know, I am a third generation female Chinese American, raised in the slums of Chicago with playmates who were not Chinese, but with playmates who were Blacks and Puerto Ricans. So that you see, just in this remark, you get a sense of my intersected gender, race, and class identities that are very much a part of who I am. Now, unlike first generation Asian American immigrants, I was not assimilated into the white dominant society of the US. I did not have to adapt a previous Asian context, a previous Asian identity to this hostile one in America. I was born into this society and I had to come to terms with it right away. I had to become an American long before I actually became an Asian American. But I had to become an American by growing up and living as a racial ethnic minority in a white-dominated society that had a violent history of racial conflict. I am also the oldest of 12 children, the first in my family to go to college. The Catholicism of my parents is an important part of my identity as a biblical scholar, believe it or not, because the Christian Asian Americans I usually encounter are Protestant, many of whom were or are evangelical. Now, unlike Protestants, I was never bound by their doctrines of biblical authority or inerrancy, particularly on the use of the Bible on social and cultural issues. So the hermeneutics of suspicion, that fancy term, that hermeneutics of suspicion, questioning and critiquing the Bible came more easily for me than for my Protestant colleagues. I was able to name the sexism, racism, homophobia, and all the other isms in the Bible as not the word of God, not the word of God, while still deeply appreciating the basic theological message of God's saving grace and love for us. Now, my eventual approach to the Bible now is in asking the ethical questions. Whom does my interpretation help? Whom does it hurt? I mean, does it hurt gays, African Americans, etc.? Whom does it hurt? And whose interests does it serve? Okay, that's how I eventually approached the Bible in my analysis of it. I became an English major in college when it became clear that I would never pass a math course that I needed for my pre-med major. I had to withdraw from my algebra course 3 times before I flunked out. To get some sort of credit for math, the college administration let me substitute a cultural anthropology course for my math requirement. So my hopelessness regarding math demolishes the ethnic stereotype of Asians being good in math. And although I rather rejected my Roman Catholicism during my college years, during my senior year, I attended a Taizé gathering with a college friend, and I had a religious conversion. I actually ended up in Taizé, France, with the first contingent from the US for one of their councils of youth. That was back in 1971. And then I hitchhiked afterwards to several Christian communities in Switzerland, Germany, and the Netherlands, returning to the US in the fire of the Spirit. While leading Catholic charismatic prayer meetings, I completed a master's degree in New Testament at Loyola University in Chicago, and a doctoral degree in Hebrew Bible at the Toronto School of Theology. Now, I was not a feminist during my doctoral studies. Why? Because I had to pass 6 language exams and do heavy coursework in the very Eurocentric methods of historical criticism. All my instructors were white male. However, several female doctoral students in biblical studies found each other to commiserate at restaurants and other gatherings. I only became a feminist during my first job at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, when I team taught with a member of the English department in a Women in Religion and Literature course. That's when I started reading feminist materials. I became chair and co-chair and then chair of the Women in the Biblical World section of the Society of Biblical Literature only in 1987. So it took a while for me to kind of become a semi-feminist, all right? So how did I become an Asian American biblical scholar? Now, as I reflected on my Asian Americanness, I recognized that becoming an Asian American scholar was a process that had been percolating since my youth. Even though I was always a woman, I had to name myself as a feminist when I finally realized that I was. Similarly, even though I was always an Asian American, I had to claim it eventually as an advocacy stance. The growing consciousness of my different positionalities were the result of both personal and institutional factors and professional factors. I mean, what I noticed was that my academic and personal formation followed the theoretical shifts in my guild, the Society of Biblical Literature. It took a very long time for the Society of Biblical Literature to acknowledge and support the female and racial ethnic scholars in its midst, since it's established in 1880. It was established in 1880, but it was only in 1992 that both the status of women in the profession committee and the Committee on Underrepresented Racial and Ethnic Minorities in the profession were finally not launched. So, I mean, these two committees for both the women in biblical studies and racial ethnics in biblical studies didn't get launched until 1992 in the Society of Biblical Literature. The first female president of the SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, was Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza in 1987. So almost 100 years after the establishment of the SBL in 1880, was there a female president of the SBL. The first African-American president was Vincent Wimbush in 2010. The first Latinx American was Fernando Segovia in 2014. And I was the first Asian American and the first woman of color of the SBL as president in 2019. Now, for my current social location, it might surprise you that I no longer consider myself a feminist Asian American biblical scholar, even though I certainly have not given up feminism. I consider myself an Asian American intersectional biblical scholar, analyzing the sacred text, not only through the lens of gender, but also through the lenses of race, of class, of colonial status, colonization, and so forth. When I want to analyze a biblical text intersectionally, there is a simple way to begin, okay? Remember that the isms of gender, race, and class are relational. They are not isolated from each other. In trying to understand all forms of subordination, that they are all connected, an Asian American lawyer, Mari Matsuda, who was one of the originators of critical race theory, I should also say, Mari Matsuda, Asian American lawyer, uses a method she calls ask the other question. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Working in coalition forces us to look for both the obvious and non-obvious relationships of domination, helping us to realize that no form of subordination ever stands alone. End quote. So when I look at the text, when I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist in the text, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? And when I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this biblical text? So what I presented in the last 25 minutes is how I see the various parts of my social location and identities as gendered, race, class, religious, and professional. That's why I see themselves as this gendered, race, class, religious, and professional individual. And that all these identities of myself as an individual are interrelated with each other. And I'm not going to be able to tell you which part of me is the female part, or which part of me is the Asian American part, or which part of me is the lower class to middle class part. All of these combine to reveal who I am. So I leave you with a question. If you were to complete a self-inventory like the one I give my students, what will you say about yourself? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gale Yee. We're delighted to have you here as part of the WATERtalk on October 20th, 2021. And I want to once again bring to the fore your new book. Much of what you have said is contained in this new book, Toward an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics, an Intersectional Anthology, published recently by Cascade Books. And I want to recommend this to people as a wonderful resource for dealing with the kind of issues that Gale has presented. In fact, if I might, Gale, I would just quote from your book. I thought the strong closing statement was really what you've just presented to us. You say, page 197, 198, it's the intersection of these aspects of who I am that come together as an Asian American interpreter of the biblical text. And this gave me a sense as a reader, Gale, that only by putting together all of the elements of ourselves can we expect to do our full work. And I think that's a really very, I think that's a very helpful insight to take away from this presentation, that for each of us, that it's only when we put together all of the aspects, leaving none aside, even the ones that are difficult or might be costly in terms of making them public or hard to deal with. I think that's just I want to repeat it because it's so good. It's the intersection of all these aspects of who I am that come together as an Asian American interpreter of the biblical text. So with that, I highly recommend the book, and I thank you very much for this presentation, which leans heavily on the book and the most important, some of the most important aspects. So now it's time for us to engage in conversation. Please go ahead.
Hello, I'm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. One of the most profound experiences I had when I was in seminary was a women in, I forget what the title, but it was Women in the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament. And the first day of class, Dr. Julia O'Brien was like, do you remember first being aware of your gender or your race? And it turned out myself and one of the African-American men in the class were the only two who were aware of our race before our gender. And it was profound in ways I can't even articulate, but it just kind of made me think of this. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that was a good question to ask the first day of class, because you really don't, I mean, I'm not even sure when I thought of myself as a, a female or an Asian American, I had to think about it. So that's a good question she did.
Yes, and I am in California as well as Gale, and I'm a priest in the diocese, the Associate for Formation and Transition Ministry. And thank you for this talk. It's really, as a Latina, as an immigrant, as a woman, in this country, and as a female priest, it's so many things come to mind when you mentioned, and all the intersections,
Yes.
of our lives. And as a person who has lived part of her life, most of her life in Guatemala, where I am from, and as a daughter of a bishop and an Episcopal bishop, and as a priest in California, it's very different. My intersections, the question that Heather was asking about the race and the gender, in my case, here in California and here in the US, that was race. If I think about it in Guatemala, it was probably gender.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, our context and where we find ourselves,
Right.
and what comes up, and the intersection between those two worlds that often collide and often contrast, and it's so incredible to hear all this and the enlightenment that you bring to us, Gale. I am so happy to have seen it in Facebook that it was happening, and to have registered last night to it and be here. So thank you.
Well, you bring up a very important point. We become aware of our identities depending on our context. I mean, you probably weren't aware of race because you are a racial ethnic majority in Guatemala. But when you come here, and with all the Latinx people here, it's a different thing, okay, a much different thing. So yes, you bring out a very important part, even though you've always been Latinx and female, certain things, parts of your identity comes out in the different context of where you are. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you both. And Gale, you talk about this in your book, where you talk about being in Asia and being understood as an American. And that's such a common experience for many people from the US, especially Black, Asian, et cetera, who are seen as Americans for the first time for some of them. It's a very difficult experience, and not to mention for other white Americans realizing our ethnicity, for example. I came to understand my Irishness one day, Sheila Kern, when I was in Dublin, and I was standing in front of the Church of Our Lady of Loretto, and out marched all these people who looked like me. See this hair, see this face. They looked like me. And, oh, okay, I get it now. They look like my mother's old friends, So, but what's interesting too is that, for those of us who are LGBTQ people, we can always tell you when we knew we were gay or when we knew we were queer. And I think, that experience around race and gender, especially for those of us who are white, would be a very important thing to reflect on. When did you know you were white? And when did you take that seriously?
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of that too.
I am in Washington, D.C., and a seminarian at Wesley Theological Seminary. My question is, I have so many, but I'll just pick one. My question is, I wonder if you can talk a little about perhaps parallel might not be the best term, but parallel experiences of intersection where you're both a woman and a person of color, or you and I are almost parallel in our own background and experience, as we are both Asian, both residing in America. However, I am a half generation immigrant here. And so our experiences are vastly different. And perhaps even Norma and I might even have more in common, as I'm assuming she's also a recent immigrant. I could be wrong. I wonder if there's something you can, if you can talk about ways in which we can find solidarity across these parallels, because what I'm seeing is people who maybe on paper should be, should be my people are not, because there is a lack of understanding on our unique experiences and differences.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I mean, we usually assume, like that. Let's say, there's an Asian American that moved into my community, and I just can't. I mean, I haven't even approached her yet about how she feels. Actually, there are a couple. Well, I know how one feels, because she's, Marco Okazawa Ray is really this Asian American activist. But there are a couple other Asians that moved in recently, and I hesitate to go and just assume that, we have this bond, here in this white, retirement community, that we now have this bond as Asian American. I have to take, I have to listen to her. I have to get to know her a little bit more, and put out tentative feelings without this presumption. Okay, I would say be on the cautious. I mean, I would say, again, just looking at my experience here of a person, who just moved in, who's Asian American, who I just cannot assume that she and I are going to be easily bonded. I mean, it's usually like, how, I mean, again, those of you who are familiar with ministerial positions being in a parish, you're a Black person, and another Black person comes in, and the white people immediately get you together, thinking you might have, something in common. I mean, see, it doesn't work that way. I mean, how we work in coalition, again, we listen, we see our common ground, okay, and then tentatively, at least for me, put out feelers. Well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? Do you agree with what's going on regarding the anti-Asian hate that's going on because of the COVID crisis? Or what do you think about what's happening at the border with the immigrants coming from Central America? So you kind of go find out and listen, and if you can be able to have time to talk, just talk sincerely. But I mean, I would say be very careful. All right, you might think somebody is part of your tribe and they are not. Okay, and they might get very resentful because you're being presumptuous. Okay, so just listen.
So what I would say in response to you, Gale, is that they also get very nervous when we spend too much time together. That's what I'd say, I don't know what to call it. What are you guys plotting? What are you guys planning?
Oh, you mean white people get nervous?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What are they doing in there together? Because we were in a book club, a bunch of us multicultural women, and they were walking back and forth, clearly very uncomfortable. Like, why didn't we get invited? Well, because it's about us this time. And so I just throw that in there.
Okay. All right.
Both of you, thanks for helpful wisdom on the question. Social locations can be deceiving. I mean, how often has the myth of homogeneity in the academy been trotted out there as if, you know, across degrees and jobs and upper middle class aspirations give a false picture, since some people come into the situation with mountains of debt and families that need their support and so forth. So these myths die hard, I think. You've been giving very wise words of counsel, both of you, to people about how to deal with them.
Okay, thanks, Gale. Well, I am Pearl. Now I live in Vancouver, Canada. I'm Asian Canadian, but most of my life I lived in Hong Kong. So I'd like to share something, some feedback, and maybe a question about from my context. When you mentioned about intersectionality, this term, this word, I remember when I studied at the Divinity School of Chongqing from 2008 to 2013, this word is so new. Nobody knows what it means. I don't know what it meant until I read about, you know, like Elizabeth Schusler Fiorenza and some, you know, like feminist theologians. Then I get to learn about this. But as you know, most the students are male, patriarchal, and many of them are from China. I mean, they don't know, because they don't see themselves, you know, as, like you said, self-inventory. They don't need to take this. So that's when I studied, you know, theology in Hong Kong. This word is like basically so new. Okay, growing up in Hong Kong, still a colony, British colony. Of course, we face all the racism, you know, those, I mean, not to mention about gender, because white people are also always supreme. We Chinese are, you know that there were clubs that say that dogs and Chinese are not allowed. Okay, that is,
yeah, that's
yes. I mean, in the Hong Kong, I mean, this is something, you know,
colonialism.
So, yeah. So growing up, I have to deal with racism, gender, and also sexual orientation. Now, what I want to share with you all is when I talked about, you know, when I chatted with Dr. Rosu last night, the ism that Hong Kong people are facing, because, you know, now the white supremacy actually exists very, very, you know, little, and we don't pay attention to that. But the ism is from, or the oppression is from the government. The Chinese government, the Hong Kong government, after they implement that national security law, and Gale, you're aware that everything just went, you know, downhill so, you know, so fast. I don't know, in the United States, do you see the government as one of the oppressors and ism like what we are experiencing in Hong Kong?
I mean, certainly not how you are experiencing this in Hong Kong, all right? But see, with Hong Kong, you know, it's also very, very, very complex, because you know, supposedly you're all Han, you know, Chinese, all right? So it's the Han Chinese colonizing, you know, other Han Chinese through the state, through their imposition and basically their colonization of Hong Kong. Okay, now we aren't. Oh, I'll ask other people, but I don't think we in the U.S. are under a colonial, you know, concerns right now. We're just really, we have parties. One party very reactionary, trying to destroy democracy, being very autocratic and power hungry. And you do have, you know, those, particularly the present administration, that are trying to hold on to democratic ideals. So we are, you know, but I don't think it's the same as, you know, China and Hong Kong, but there is an interesting fight, you know, of tribes, all right, here in the US that are trying to, one, trying to keep power, all right, restored and keep democracy. The other one trying to, grab onto power and assert an autocratic rule.
The question was just about, you mentioned this hermeneutics of suspicion. I don't know, I was just interested in your comments about your experience in seeing that your evangelical colleagues undertook biblical critique in a much different way because of how they viewed, I think it was social justice in the Bible, and correct me if I'm wrong. I am Protestant, I identify as Lutheran, although I would not put myself in the same category as evangelical as I am in the ELCA. I just think it's different. But just thinking of sort of the rise in what I would call like white evangelical radicalization, especially in the last 5 years, I was just curious about sort of what shifts do you notice in biblical critiques, or this notion of the hermeneutics of suspicion as a professor and scholar?
Okay. Back in when feminism was coming out, okay, I mean, I encountered and this was very eye-opening for me, I encountered the article by Marianne Tolbert, all right, in one of the first volumes on feminist biblical interpretation. It was done in Samaya, and she lamented about, the hold that the hold that the biblical authority held on Protestant women. Okay, it was very enlightening to me. I'm not sure if it was at the time, that being a Roman Catholic, I had that hold because I wasn't sure about it myself, but that was a very much important article for me, that I am not under the Bible, and I do not regard it as, quote, literal truth or whatever kind of truth in the mouths of men, or whether, I mean, for me, and this might be heretical, but for me, it's a very deeply spiritual document, all right? But it's not completely all true. And that notion of biblical authority and truth and its inherency is not the way I approach the Bible, but I do see it still in some ways when people, in some of the scholarship of biblical scholars that I know, that they dance around, the problems in the text rather than going toward it. So, I mean, I think I think it's still part of feminist biblical scholarship, unless I am totally depraved and, don't see the beauty in the biblical text as much as my Protestant, biblical scholars, Protestant feminist biblical scholars. But I sometimes think that notion of this is the word of God puts such a crutch on them that they cannot see the entirety, the intersectionality, if I can put it that way, of the biblical text. Okay.
I'm the priest of a historically African-American church in Oregon. And I was intrigued by your comments about when you read a passage and see homophobia, you ask a question about class. And so that intersectional interpretation of scripture, I think one of the things that has really stood out to me is that there are different ways of being Black. I think that's kind of already come up. There's different ways of being Asian and Asian American. One of the things that I see, especially in the Episcopal Church, is that class is a huge issue that goes unspoken almost all of the time. And that many of the ways I see in which my congregation members that come from different backgrounds of Black church, class is often the rub, but nobody talks about that. And so I was just curious if you have some insights in terms of, at a congregational level, how do we talk about intersectionality when we're interpreting scripture? When I'm preaching, how might I help frame that for my congregation?
Okay.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Just want to quickly ask about that. I'm also a Columbia School of Theology PhD student and working as a pastor in Korean Methodist Church. As a student, international student, at the same time as a minister, just curious about that, this wonderful kind of a great polished and refined interpretation of the Bible, how could really apply to our next generation, and, in the youth. So because they really hungry to hear about this kind of liberating messages in their actual lives. So how can I really use your wonderful word to use in my some ministerial context? So curious about that, and also want to say thank you so much for your work as an Asian American wonderful work, and then also want to say thank you Penn Adams' great work to raising up some Asian American great biblical scholars. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. On class, I'll tell you, when I first started Episcopal Divinity School, my Irma Bauer-Levesque, those of you at EDS, Irma Bauer-Levesque, she just was complaining about, she's a Roman Catholic, and she sees the class, the high class, opinions of Episcopalians, and you can kind of see it in, Virginia, basically, where I got my doctor divinity. There's this sense of, upperclassness that, is not apparent for some people, Roman Catholics, basically, all right, or for others, maybe other denominations, but definitely class is, as you say, Marie, class is a huge issue for the Episcopal Church. I mean, I think one of the reasons why, EDS was destroyed was because of white liberal upper class Episcopalians, basically, on our board, basically. So I do believe that there is a problem of class in the Episcopal Church. Now, suggestions for your congregation, Jung Jin. Again, I would say trust your own wisdom, and I would say, you read. I mean, whatever I give you will be coming from my context, but my context is not your context. That you can read your congregation better than me, okay? You can read your congregation and what they need to hear better than me. So, continue to do your reading, but you want to go and synthesize what you read to be able to give it to your congregation. So that's what my suggestion for you. Your congregation is totally different. It's an immigrant. It sounds like it's an immigrant congregation, international congregation, and those are things that I am not. Okay, so but you are. All right, you are. You have that wisdom to give to them. So I trust that they are in good hands with you.
Thank you so much.
Well, we have been in very good hands with you, Gale Yee. We have been in the best of hands today. And I want to once again mention the book, Towards an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics and Intersectional Anthology. I highly recommend it for all of us for reading and for use with students and community groups, because it touches on many of these topics in even more depth than we've been able to go into today. Excuse me, I would like to close our session. Excuse me, I think I'm getting your allergies, Gale. by thanking you for your time with us today, and especially for your wisdom. I think that you have demonstrated once again, not only what a great teacher and writer you are, but also a person of enormous wisdom, and with the humility to articulate it so that other people feel very empowered. And that really is not common in an ego-driven field like ours. I could say candidly.